difficulty tonight,
There you go.
but we're glad to be with you, and I bring you to my room that's under construction. But it's got air conditioning and good light, so here we are.
Yeah.
We're reading chapter 7 tonight of Beyond Resistance, and for those of you that have joined us before, welcome back, and for folks that are new to the page, this is a book by Pastor John Dorhauer, and it discusses the evolution of the church in the postmodern era. So we're reading chapter 7, but posted in our videos on our Facebook page, you will find all the other previous chapters if you need to catch up.
Right.
Tonight's chapter 7 is called A Growing Multiplicity, and it opens with probably part of a song by the Indigo Girls. There's more than one answer to these questions, pointing me in a crooked line. The less I seek my source for some definitive, the closer I am to find. And we begin. I grew up a Roman Catholic until I met Dan Arnold, who lived behind me in the house I grew up in. I didn't realize that there were anything but Roman Catholics in the world. Okay, kind of sounds like my upbringing. Turns out Dan was Baptist. I had no earthly idea what that was. The fences that separated our yards were about 30 feet apart. I will never forget how one morning we both sat behind those fences and asked each other questions about our respective faiths. I was deeply curious, intrigued. I was learning something that I'd sensed even then. I was probably 8 years old at the time. It was important. Not everyone walks their journey in faith the same way. I didn't know anything about religious tolerance at that age. All I knew was that Dan Arnold was my best friend. We played together almost every day. It was baseball in the apple orchard or the back alley during the summertime. It was basketball in his backyard or football in mine during the fall. It was hockey in the streets during the long winter months. We would ride bikes around the neighborhood, collect, compare, and trade baseball cards, and sometimes just talk. I loved the guy. The thought of him going to hell never crossed my mind. The world was a pretty closed world. My world was a pretty closed world. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in northwest St. Louis County. I went to a Catholic grade school. I went to Mass 6 days a week, most weeks, and sometimes when I was listed as an altar boy on the Saturday morning schedule, it was 7 days a week. If it weren't for Dan Arnold living 30 feet away from my house, I would have gone my entire first decade of life without ever talking to someone who wasn't a Catholic. Well, that's not entirely true. I had many conversations with people who weren't Catholic. It's just that I never knew it. I assumed they were, and if they weren't, they never told me otherwise. I knew some of the neighborhood children that went to public schools, but those same kids played on my soccer and baseball teams sponsored by my Catholic church. The home church sponsored and outfitted 52 soccer teams.
Wow.
Growing up in St. Louis meant playing Catholic-sponsored youth soccer and baseball. I just assumed they were all Catholic. Dan was a revelation to me. He introduced me to something outside of my sphere of understanding. He was a building block to what would develop into a postmodern mind. In his book, Postmodern Christianity, John Riggs refers to the postmodernism as an irreducibly plural. Dan Arnold was the first step in my world becoming irreducibly plural after having been raised in one of the most irreducibly monocultural environments you could imagine in the late 20th century America. While I remember clearly that conversation with Dan, what I don't remember with precision or clarity is the genesis of the internal struggle that would evolve. I'm now a conference minister in the United Church of Christ. Something happened. You don't get from there to here without some drama unfolding along the way. Trust me, there was drama. Before any of it, before the thousand little things and the few not so little things that would conspire to open this pathway for me, there was Dan Arnold. In the seemingly countless days of Catholic indoctrination during my childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, I heard over and over again one of the teachings of the Catholic Church: ex excelsia nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. Clarity about these exact moments escapes me. I don't know when it was precisely that I heard this teaching for the first time. I don't remember when it was exactly that it dawned on me that if this was true, Dan Arnold could not be saved. I don't know exactly when that realization caused me to start thinking with a questioning mind about other things I was told to accept. I probably don't have to do the translation for you, but I will. For me to accept this teaching of the church, ex excelsia nulla salus, I had to believe that my best friend, who had already demonstrated to me that his faith in Jesus was as deep and profound as mine, was going to hell. Worse than that, his going to hell was part of a code authorized and approved by the God I worshiped. That rocked my world. Early seeds of rebellion against the religion of my childhood were planted somewhere in that dirt. This was not an epiphany that woke me up. It just didn't unfold that way at all. It was a long, slow process that evolved over years. My acceptance of Catholicism wasn't something I thought at all about. It just was. I don't think to breathe. I don't think about my right foot going 2.5 feet in front of my left foot when I take my next step. I don't think about why I put clothes on every morning. Some things just are, and because they are, you don't question or even take notice of doing them or not doing them. Catholicism was like that for me. It just was. It would take a long, long time for me to realize that there was a marketplace of ideas competing with one another in my own mind and that I had choices. Even when they started to emerge, I fought them hard for a long time. I think I even saw them as tests, temptations to stray, which a good boy must resist. Over time, I just could not reconcile what I felt about my childhood pal with what I was being taught. I would spend 8 years in a Catholic seminary. Priesthood was not just my childhood dream, it was my calling. I didn't doubt that at all. Questions just kept coming, though. These questions had me seeking desperately for answers that would help me reconcile my emotions with my faith. The strongest emotion was trying to reconcile with a God who had taken an interest in condemning my best friend to hell. I believed that the church had to know something that I was missing that would help me make sense of these things, and so I kept pushing for answers. I suspected it was I who had things mixed up and that someone would say something that helped me understand it. As long as I believed that, I hung in there. It was a very painful day when I realized that what I believed and what the church was asking me to believe could not be reconciled. It meant giving up my call to be a priest. I knew that was coming years before I would let myself believe it. I knew I could never, with any kind of integrity, pledge a vow of obedience to my bishop that would require me to require others to believe things that in my own heart had not yet come to believe. I was, without that vocabulary to articulate it, becoming irreducibly plural. I had to find a spiritual pathway that would accommodate this plurality, and it wasn't going to be in the faith of my childhood. I have Dan Arnold to thank for that. I also have Dan Arnold to thank for my wife in a very, very roundabout way. Even before I fell in love with her, I knew she was a Lutheran. I had already wrestled with my expanding pluralism. The thought of spending the rest of my life with a Lutheran brought no internal conflict to my heart whatsoever. Our relationship blossomed without the sometimes debilitating argument about whose faith would be practiced in the relationship. Just as wrestling with what the church had to say about Dan would eventually lead me to leave seminary, falling in love with Mimi the Lutheran led me to walk away from my Catholic roots altogether and choose another spiritual pathway. Mimi the Lutheran. There was never any anti-Catholicism in this for me. It was just that I had come to accept that being a disciple of the one I called Jesus was no less authentic for me as a Lutheran. I was often asked after that why I left the church. The question came from all of my old Catholic friends. My response took them by surprise. I didn't. I was as much a part of the church as a Protestant Lutheran as I had ever been while Catholic. Post-Christian. My story is a familiar one. Life experience for postmoderns explode assumptions long held by those who preceded us. Most prominent among them is the assumption that whatever group, tribe, culture, or faith to which you belong is the norm, against which all others are judged. Our world has grown so much smaller than it once was. It is certainly possible to live as if your worldview predominates, but it is harder and harder to do that and not to collide with people close to you who have a very different perspective. The circle of meaningful relationships for postmoderns has become so richly diverse with parochialism, nativism, chauvinism, racism, and spiritual exclusivism are getting harder and harder to defend without challenge or ridicule. It is certainly harder to defend those impulses without jeopardizing meaningful relationships. Postmoderns are highly suspect of organizations that want to justify their existence by condemning others. Postmoderns, by and large, don't buy into the concept of joining or becoming a member of any organization, in part for this very reason. Postmoderns are, to some extent, samplers. They want experiences that take them out of comfort zones, that expand worldviews, and that enrich lives. Being enticed down by a spiritual pathway that requires them to brand themselves as Lutheran or Episcopalian or Methodist or even Christian not only far less appeal to postmoderns, it is often the very reason they walk away from the church. Postmodern Christianity is already in the process of becoming a post-denominational church. Why I don't think denominations are going to go extinct anytime soon, I do think we are going to see mergers, partnerships, and downsizing as denominations realize over time that they are attracting fewer and fewer customers to the marketplace they currently occupy. Calling postmodern Christians post-denominational is a way of saying that their expression of Christianity will resist any attempt to define it in a way that results in either a separation from others seeking spiritual sustenance, or even worse, requires a presumption of superiority over them. It's not that the postmoderns fear differentiation. It is more that they don't want to invest in anything that inhibits meaningful relationships with others who have a different set of beliefs or a different worldview. Differentiation is important. This is who I am. Tell me who you are. Let's explore how a relationship might affect our assumptions about that. Calling postmodern Christians post-denominational is also a way of distinguishing it from the current model of the church. Church 2.0 has learned that it is important to claim a pathway that is uniquely Methodist or uniquely Lutheran or uniquely Presbyterian. Whether by design or accident, I am sure there is plenty of both hidden in our history somewhere. Church 2.0 is a setup in such a way that it isn't enough that you brand yourself a Christian. What kind of Christian are you is an important question for the church as it is currently structured. Calling postmodern Christians post-denominational is also insufficient. It indicates that they are not going to invest in a model of the church that brands one expression of Christianity as different from or better than the other. It is important to know that about the postmodern Christian. It is also important to know that if that's all you know about postmodern Christianity, it isn't enough. Postmodern Christianity is also post-Christian. We have to be careful here. Post-Christian isn't anti-Christian. It is, however, a way of fully expressing a fundamental commitment to the way of Jesus without any need or desire to see that as the only way or the better way. It is simply a way. There is a ready acceptance among postmodern seekers to see other pathways as legitimate. There is no need to argue that because a pathway is authentic for me, your choice is reduced to that as your only legitimate option. Most postmoderns go even further than that. By accepting Christianity as a pathway to pursue their faith authentically, they are not only saying that other options are legitimate for other people, they are saying other pathways are legitimate for them. Postmodern Christians are willing to explore what they can learn from the Jewish faith, the Hindu faith, the Muslim faith, etc. This means that the postmodern church is going to have a hard time with a Christianity that expresses itself in such a way that the Hindus, the Muslims, the Jews, the agnostics, or the atheists are made to feel either unwelcome or inferior. For this very reason, Church 2.0 is going to feel like an alien church to most postmoderns. I preached at one of my Southwest Conference churches not long ago. Remember, I served the United Church of Christ. If I had chosen a gospel passage, and it won't surprise you to hear that Jesus was featured prominently in the story, he showed up a couple of times in my sermon. When the service ended, a woman from the choir came over to me and told me how disorienting it was for her to hear so much emphasis on Jesus. She was very concerned that the atheist who worshiped with them would be offended. I wanted to spend a little time unpacking that moment because it is one of the most telling examples of one way of being church colliding with another way of being church. Jesus triumphant. The church that I grew up in, that I was educated in, and that I have been professionally trained to lead in is a Christian church that sees Jesus triumphant as all of the following: the way, the truth, and the life. The means of attaining salvation, the Son of God, fully human and yet supremely divine, a miracle worker, a prophet, but be careful not to say that in a way that could lead anyone to assume that he was just a prophet or that his way of being prophet wasn't far superior to all others who took on that role before and after him. One who hears and answers prayer, present in the breaking of the bread, or where 2 or 3 are gathered, friend, and really so much more. There is inherent in all of this an understanding that while other faiths, other religions, and other spiritual pathways might have the potential to lead people to enlightenment, it would be a sacrilege to speak, act, or teach in ways that would suggest that they are anything but inferior to the one true faith. Jesus is God, best self-expression. At its extreme, Christianity teaches that without a foundational belief in Jesus as Son of God, there is nothing but eternal damnation awaiting. Even when Christianity is more progressive or tolerant, there is still an irreducible belief that those who don't know Jesus are missing something. They can still be good people and live meaningful lives, but if they knew the real Jesus, they would see the light and come to accept him as the better way. For the longest time, I was conditioned to feel sorry for those who had not yet come to believe in Jesus. As a Catholic, of course, that pity emanated from a knowledge that without a basic belief in Jesus, eternal condemnation awaited. With the pity came a naive sense that those who didn't believe just hadn't been given enough information about or experiences with the risen Christ. No one who had been granted the privilege of a personal encounter with Jesus would deny him. If they did, well, they deserved the hell they were getting. This notion grew to the point that any person who died without having received Jesus was somehow my fault. I had failed them. With greater effort, zeal, or powers of persuasion, I could have made the difference for them. Had I done a better job as a true Christian, no one to whom I offered the invitation to deny him. What's that?
Hey.
We're taking a little doggy break here.
You can keep going.
Oh, okay, thanks. There are varying degrees to which Christianity still functions this way, even if I don't. It has been the predominant worldview for most churches for a very long time. No study of the history of the church would be complete without an acknowledgement that this theology, combined with the power of the sword and state since the time of Constantine, has wreaked havoc on the globe. Colonialism, white power and supremacy, manifest destiny, the Crusades, global expansionism, and the Holocaust are all examples of how oppressive and unjust the church can be when it allies itself with empire. Here are excerpts from Requiemento, a document written by the Spanish monarchy in 1513 and based on a papal bull written by Pope Alexander VI in 1493. The papal bull declared that the whole world was sovereign to God's ruler on earth, namely the Pope. The Requiemento was a declaration of war against any sovereign power that dared to think that whatever land it controlled belonged to them. It was read in Spanish by the explorers, funded by the King and the Queen of Spain. It argued that since all lands belong to the Pope and they are there as his representatives, they are authorized to enforce sovereignty or to conquer the inhabitants of the land. These are excerpts. On the part of the king, Don Fernando, subduer of the barbarous nations, we, their servants, notify and make known to you as best we can that the Lord our God, living and eternal, created heaven and earth, and that one man and one woman, of whom you and we, all the men of the world at the time, were and are descendants, and all those who came after and before us. Of these nations, God our Lord gave charge to one man called St. Peter that he should be Lord and superior of all of the men in the world, that all should obey him, and that he should be the head of the whole human race. One of these pontiffs who succeeded that St. Peter as Lord of the world, in the dignity and seat which I have before mentioned, made donation of these isles and terra firma to the aforesaid king and queen and to their successors, our lords. Wherefore, as we best can, we ask and require you that you consider what we have said to you, and that you take the time that shall be necessary to understand and deliberate upon it, and that you acknowledge to the church as the ruler and superior of the whole world. If you do so, you will do well, and that which you are obliged to do in their highnesses, and we in their name shall receive you in all love and charity, and shall leave you, your wives and your children and your lands free without servitude. But if you do not do this and maliciously make delay in it, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. In case you missed that, Spanish armies would land, meet the natives, read this document in a language that they did not understand, force them to relinquish the land and convert to the one true church. If not, they would face forced servitude, exile, torture, banishment, and death. and all in the name of Jesus. This was an extreme. Not all who espouse a fundamental belief in Jesus as the way to eternal salvation take their powers of persuasion quite this far. It should be noted, however, that the amount of human degradation and suffering caused by those who do or did take this to the extreme cannot be calculated. It should also be noted that the same impulses that forced me to wrestle with the thought of Dan Arnold going to hell are the same impulses that birthed the Crusades and the Holocaust. From the Inquisition to the Crusades of colonialism to the pogroms of the Holocaust, the Christian Church's zeal to conquer and convert has left a trail of bloodshed, violence, and injustice throughout its history. The Tao of postmodernity. Postmodernity wants none of that. Postmoderns have lost their thirst for blood. To say that there is an embarrassment about what hath been brought in the blessed name of Jesus would be to grossly understate the case. There is a shame that compels a new breed of Christians to live in an irreducibly plural life. There is a strong desire to produce in the church new impulses. Those impulses born of that irreducible pluralism are to place Christianity along all the great religions of the world as an equal at its best and as admittedly far inferior at its worst. Spirituality, faith, and religion exist to elicit a sense of awe and wonder toward the ineffable, the mysterious, the inexpressible, the sacred, the divine. They exist to engender a genuine sense of self-worth and dignity. They exist to create a desire to offer one's life or talents in service to the common good. They exist to remind us that at our best, we love one another and treat our brother and sister the way we wish to be treated by them. I think that might be a typo, the way we wish to be treated by them. Almost every culture has discovered the sacred or the divine and experienced that presence as life-giving and life-affirming. Those experiences engender ritual, discipline, narrative, and faith. The practice of that faith, the rehearsal of that narrative, the undertaking of that discipline, and the acting out of that ritual serve to help human community evolve in peaceful, loving, and generative ways. They help us to process grief and shame and meet the new day with some sense of hope or with some tools to cope. In his insightful work, The Evolution of God, Robert Wright observes that more and more people are getting intertwined in non-zero-sum relationships. That is a brilliant observation. As we continue to rely more heavily on each other, our cultural evolution requires us to a greater sense of cooperation, tolerance, understanding, and acceptance. Robert Wright believes that the prospect of successfully playing a non-zero-sum game breeds decency. To borrow John Riggs' language, it breeds irreducible pluralism. This is the world of the postmodern, and whatever expression of faith emerges in their new paradigm will bear witness to that. Post-Christian Christians will be a strange, almost unrecognizable breed when viewed from the perspective of churches 1.0 and 2.0. Gone will be the impulse to preach, convert, and baptize non-believers for the salvation of their mortal soul. Gone will be the Christology that needs Jesus to be sovereign or savior. Gone will be the inclination to reduce all authentic spiritual truth to what the Bible can tolerate. In its place will be a church filled with disciples of Jesus who walk in his way and who do their best to be faithful practitioners of all that they understand him to have been. They will be more comfortable with a seated Buddha on the desk or mantle than with a cross. Have one on my desk. They will attend services at temple, synagogue, mosque, sweat lodge, and church. They will baptize those who find that meaningful, but will never think that differently about a fellow disciple of Jesus who doesn't see anything meaningful in that ritual. They will read from the Quran, from the Bhagavad Gita, Confucius, the Vedas, and many other spiritual texts. They will consult spiritual directors, life coaches, mentors, rabbis, imams, priests, shamans, and others who demonstrate a capacity to put them in touch with the sacred. Remember the woman that met me after I preached my sermon in her church and who felt I may have offended the atheists that joined them on Sunday morning? This is she. She is already living out that sense of irreducible pluralism. She is a postmodern. So is her church. In the same worship space that her community uses on Sunday morning, a Jewish congregation worships on Saturday morning, and then an independent Catholic church, pastored by a female priest, worships on Sunday evening. Meanwhile, a drum circle of Native Americans gathers on the parking lot during every new moon for their own spiritual sustenance, and their spiritual guide uses the church for her office space. For many, this is too much. Their brand of Christianity cannot go that far. For others, their worldview has shifted and the vessel built to contain modern Christianity no longer holds them. Their choices are to abandon Christianity as it currently exists or to reinvent it. Many have opted for the former, but so many others are attempting the latter. I stand among those who wish the latter the best. I hope, like hell, that inspired by the sacred, the divine, the holy, they complete the task. Because if they don't, for more and more people with each passing year, there really only will be one option. In each of the next 4 chapters, I'm going to describe a postmodern community. They are all very different. They have unique characteristics that differentiate them from one another. This is far from a comprehensive look at the postmodern faith community. I'm not sure that such a look can be fully exposed. It is, however, a glimpse and an important one. When I did my research for this project, I wasn't just exploring the new. I wasn't only asking questions about what was different and why. I was exploring something with far more meaning for me personally. I have come to understand that my role as a middle judicatory officer for the institutional church is not to preserve the institution or any of its component parts. My role is to preserve the unique proclamation of the gospel that made this expression of the church necessary in the first place. That's the deeper question I was asking. It wasn't, who are you? Although I did get some insight into that. It wasn't, what motivates you? Although learning about those motivations turned out to be important. It wasn't, how did you undertake your mission? Although there is much to be learned in exploring that very question. No, it was something much more basic than all of that. The question I went looking to resolve was this: can we trust the gospel to these outsiders? That's offensive language, I know that. I own that. Nonetheless, that is the big question underlying all the grief, the anxiety, the fear of the institutional church today. We are dying, goes the oft-heard refrain. Behind that lies a deeper fear. Will the gospel die with us? These stories are told both as a response to the more utilitarian questions about who and how and why, but far more importantly, as a response to the far deeper question about succession. I can only hope that as I report what I experienced, the reader will come to trust, as I did, that the gospel as we know it is in good hands. It is my hope that your own explorations of these postmodern communities of faith are no threat to the current expression of the church, and in fact are going to preserve the good news and make it relevant in people's lives in ways my church can't. This is very gratifying to me. In the end, this was an exploration of hope after a time when decades of diminishing capacities had eroded hope. My time with and among these innovators came as a blessing to me. What happened was nothing short of my own personal transformation from despair to hope, from confusion about a way to clarity of purpose and intent, from sorrow and deep grief to joy and abiding promise.
Wow.
So ends chapter 7.
Yeah.
And if that wasn't a wake-up call. Part where they talk about jeopardy, perhaps the gospel, and how many fear that we're losing that.
Right.
I had flashes of like the Victorian era when suddenly women could be seen out in public without their high-necked dresses, or God forbid that their ankles not be covered or something like that. I mean, this is big. I mean, it's religion is as old as dirt, for heaven's sakes, yet it has evolved and it continues to evolve. And I'm sure that folks that lived through the prior revolutions, for example, of 1.0 to 2.0, or heck, he talks about being in a Catholic seminary and marrying a Lutheran. Even when Martin Luther left seminary and didn't knock down, but he was locked out of the seminary and nailed his theses to the door, and they refused to entertain his questions. But that birthed a whole new religion too. There's always going to be some fear, but it doesn't necessarily mean that bad things are going to come from it. And this is the very essence, that we face fears. This is a big thing too with, can't think of his first name, but Pastor Rohr, who does a lot of motivational, meditative type of writings, says that you have to really work through that pain in order to become stronger and to grow from it. It's like going from the first part of life into the second part of life in a human's terms. Only this is yet another evolution of the church. So that kind of encapsulated for me chapter 7.
Right. And I would only add that I think GPC is such a welcoming place. It's no matter what religion you came from, it's a place for people who are trying to reconcile the questions that he opened with, in terms of how can one religion be superior to another.
Exactly.
If the construct is that God is who we strive to emulate, if you will, and to embody the Gospels and Jesus as God on earth. So, you know, it was just interesting how many people are at GPC who have still walked that initial part of his chapter, you know.
Yep. I totally agree with you on that. And that's why it's amazing, because we found ourselves in a place that was non-denominational, every single one of us. And we come from, what did we count, 68 traditions, something like that.
Right.
But yet there's even more revolution to come from where we've already been. It doesn't necessarily stop there. It talks about bringing people of even all more faiths that are from other organized religions and doing maybe less gospel laced, but still gospel based.
Sure.
Good things, like continuing with the food ministries that we're doing right now.
Right.
And then feeding people in other ways, bringing small groups of people together to discuss challenges and others that overcame them, and doing things like bringing kids together to do different types of service projects, and bringing families together to do fitness classes and stuff like that. This is where we need to be. And this, believe it or not, is gospel based, but not necessarily gospel laced.
Right.
We have a prime opportunity to evolve and almost reinvent ourselves from the same principles that we live by. And again, but it's resistance. And when you see these things on paper, you say to yourself, gee, why is it so hard? But then you consider the human condition, and it's like, people like to be comfortable.
Right. Yeah. But he illuminates whenever two or more are gathered in his name. So
absolutely.
Gonna keep bringing it together.
Yes, indeed. Well,
there you go.
Thank you for joining me tonight, Kim, and everybody who joined us tonight out on Facebook land. Thank you for joining us. We'll be here again next Thursday night, hopefully without the technical difficulties that we had tonight, and be ready to start at 6:30 on Chapter 8 of Beyond Resistance. Amen.
Reimagine. There you go.
So everybody continue to be well, continue to be safe, wear your mask, wash your hands, all that happy stuff.
Stay healthy.
Yes, indeed. We'll see you all again. Now, how do I shut this off?
Thanks, Lynn.
Oh, thank you. Take care. Good night.
Night.
We'll see you.